Well, Dr. Jaffe, we're all sort of really interested in this brand new article that was put about just recently in the JAMA, suggesting that vitamin D is not really effective for fracture prevention, not effective for building bone density. It was a recent study by Burt et al. And what's striking to us is this flies in the face of all the research we've been doing and seeing over decades, and certainly in face of the natural anthropological fact that we study so much, that an indigenous population exposed to the general sunlight will have a 40 or 50 Ng level. And this argument that bringing people up to those levels, or perhaps even a higher level, is not effective. We're sort of startled at this. I would definitely like your interpretation of this study. It was a trial that was done over a number of years, giving doses of either 400 units, 4,000 units, or 10,000 units of vitamin D a day, and where they report that there wasn't any changes in what they call bone strength, but it's really a measure of volumetric bone density of the radius and the tibia. So can you help us understand, this certainly flies in the face of all the research we have seen over the years about vitamin D actually helping to build bone strength and being essential for bone strength.
Well, let's start at the beginning of the article. They're going to measure over time the effect of a single nutritive, yes, a neurohormone called vitamin D, at different doses in what is essentially the equivalent of a preliminary pharmacology trial.
Okay.
So the fatal flaw of what they did is that they assumed that vitamin D alone, an important neurohormone indeed, that vitamin D alone is sufficient in this 21st century to be able to even ask the question of the impact of vitamin D on, say, fracture healing, on different measures of bone quality. Mm-hmm. But if you assume that vitamin D is a medicine, a prescriptive pharmaceutical, then you can do the kind of trial they did and conclude what they did, which is doesn't work. Mm-hmm. But as you remember, Susan, you challenged me many years ago. We had a dozen people who by DEXA, the classic measure of bone density, followed our lifestyle program that includes vitamin D as one of many lifestyle enhancements to build, restore, maintain healthy bone. Mm-hmm. Because as you correctly say, better bones, better bodies. Mm-hmm. So this study, as a methodologist, this study as a molecular biologist, I'm not talking about myself in the third person, mm-hmm. but as a clinician, I would have the same concerns you do, because I wouldn't understand that the study itself was fatally flawed by design, not by intention. I have no idea of the intention. I'm telling you that when you pick an inappropriate methodology, mm-hmm. like what is the equivalent of a dose ranging study in pharmaceutical drug development, mm-hmm. and you apply that to any nutrient, including vitamin D, I can predict that the study will fail and that the conclusion of the study is doesn't help. Now you can fill in the blank. In this case, it's vitamin D, but it could be any nutrient, any essential nutrient, any vitamin mineral cofactor. When you study it as a pharmaceutical, you misunderstand the nature of biology, of life, of bone health. Mm-hmm. We have together looked at all of the essential nutrients, vitamins, minerals, cofactors, and so forth, that are needed for healthy bone. And we shift people from today's metabolic acidosis, which they ignore. We shift people from overstress hormone conditions, which they largely ignore. And they are asking a very simple question, the answer to which is, I predict it won't work. I was sure it wouldn't work when I heard about the design. I have no idea about their intention, but I can tell you they did not choose the right scientific method. They did not use the right scientific design. The right scientific design is what we have done in community-based outcome studies and successfully improved on best standard of care in type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, fibromyalgia, muscle pain, adrenal dysfunction, and with your collaboration, we published the data and we showed new bone formation, unprecedented new bone formation by DEXA confirmed in just 2 years of following a program that included vitamin D and the other essential nutrients for bone health, which most people are deficient in. And if you just boost the vitamin D, you won't correct the deficiency in antioxidants, you won't correct the B complex deficit, you won't correct the magnesium and other mineral deficits. You need a team, you need a whole symphony of essential nutrients to build healthy bone. Now, when you start from the premise of lifestyle comprehensive program based on predictive biomarkers interpreted to their best outcome results, when you include tests of immune hypersensitivity so that we allow people and encourage people to eat the foods that they can digest, assimilate, and eliminate without immune burden, now you have the back capacity to ask the following question. In a population intensively supplemented and who practices a bone healthy lifestyle to the best of their ability, you can now test different doses of vitamin D and compare outcomes. And now I predict you're going to get better outcomes when people are in the 50 to 80 nanogram range for D2, the correct analyte on vitamin D, as you know, is now vitamin D2. You can, in some cases, measure all three, D1, D2, D3.
Right.
It's not necessary as a screening procedure. I do think that every adult should have their vitamin D level assessed. And yes, Gina Colada, who wrote this in the New York Times, is correct that the nation is low in vitamin D. But to me, that's a cause for concern. That's an opportunity for prevention and health promotion, because it is clear that cancer risk, cardiovascular risk, digestive disorder risk, intoxication of various kinds, mood disorders, sleep disorders are all related to low vitamin D and the other essential and necessary cofactors to make the vitamin D work. So with respect, the design was fatally flawed, the results are predictable, and my conclusion is the opposite of theirs. My conclusion is that healthy people in the 21st century must bring their vitamin D level into the 50 to 80 range. And you tell me how much it takes of your preferred vitamin D to get that from diet, from sunlight, but most importantly from supplements.
So essentially what we see is that there's so many factors involved in the building and maintenance of bone that you cannot isolate one factor, even if you tend to use high dose, and say that's going to make a startling difference when we don't compensate for the other factors.
Right. No, sir, I want to say that again, because it's so important and it's a differentiating, very important differentiating point. If you need 10 things in order for your osteoblasts and osteoclasts to work properly, to break down old bone that's worn out and replace it with new bone, if you want that to happen, you absolutely must have sufficiency, not too little, not too much. The Goldilocks scenario in functional medicine turns out to be correct, and we have to find out for each person, what is that just enough? Not too much, not too little, but sufficient. Now that reframes every aspect of laboratory medicine. It reframes every aspect of clinical assessment and care. And as you know, for the last 3 or 4 decades, we have been specializing in getting superior results in cases where everyone else says it's impossible because they want to know the one thing to do when in fact there may be 18 or so factors essential for bone. And yes, I guess in a philosophical sense, we could say everything's connected to everything else. But in a practical sense, I can tell you that 2B6 do not replace B12, that you cannot assume that all antioxidants or all carotenoids or all polyphenolics are the same. And very often people who rush in with too little understanding of the nuances and the subtleties, and they're welcome to read review articles that you and I and Jayashri and others have published in those books. The Watson series on it's food and nutrition in healthy life, I think is the series. But Watson is an excellent editor, and they've been gracious to have us include a chapter in, I think, every one of their texts over the last number of years. Folks can find these online if they want to get the details. But the bottom line is that when you're studying health and health promotion, when you're studying things like life, when you're studying things like healthy bone renewal, it's a multivariable experiment. You can start with best standard of care. You can start with the standard of care of today according to any society of your choice. And I promise that if you follow through on what we're talking about, the predictive biomarkers that cover epigenetics, so that you can improve upon your biology and functioning, and then come back in just 6 months, where in our trials, and they've been 6-month community-based best effort trials. These are not done in an institution. This is done people living their lives, as you know. And what we found is that in just 6 months, with regard to, say, type 1 and type 2 diabetes in 2 separate studies, we were able to reduce the hemoglobin A1C, the average measure of extra sugar stuck onto your hemoglobin protein. We were able to reduce that by a full milligram percent, which means adding 20 plus years of quality life at low cost in just 6 months and with best efforts. Now, if you say to me, we want to do another study with people who optimize their optimize your recommendations, we'd be happy to do that study. But we know how to do community-based studies with many different variables and compare one group with the other. Usually the best standard of care is the control group. And what we recommend, the intensive epigenetic modulation approach, is the experimental group. And I am proud to tell you, very pleased to tell you, that every one of our studies, though done on relatively small numbers of people, reached significance of better than 0.05, which means they were statistically significant. Right. And that's the goal of an outcome study, is not just to see a favorable trend or a few anecdotes, but that you, over a population, see a significant, statistically meaningful, mathematically meaningful difference.
You know, it's interesting, going back to this new vitamin D study, they themselves say that one possible issue is they didn't look at things like calcium intake or the other nutrient intakes. Certainly, we wouldn't expect vitamin D to be able to compensate for many issues like acid-base balance, like this low level of antioxidants that's consumed in the American diet, the low level of minerals. So to expect that, I see your point about doing this as a drug study, to suspect that this one independent variable would have a dramatic change on volumetric bone density, which is something that hasn't been studied a lot either.
No, and let me just put in a footnote on volumetric bone density. It is easy to do. It has meaning. That is, you can compare a person with themselves over time. But it is not the DEXA system. It does avoid X-ray, so that might be a positive. But volumetric bone density is a technique that needs to show its strengths, limitations, and what we call variability. And there is not enough experience with the technique at this point in time. And they kind of say that. They did use it. They report their results, and I commend them for doing the study. But when you know, just to say again, especially in the 21st century, where you ignore the relative excess of calcium and the absolute deficiency of magnesium, the relative excess of copper and the absolute deficiency of zinc. And then what about the molybdenum and the manganese? What about the iodide and the iodine? What about the stable strontium and any other of the essential minerals, nutrients, cofactors that are absolutely necessary? We know this with 100% certainty. If you want happy osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and you need them both working for you full time, because as you know, Susan, and I want to remind our listeners, the oldest part of you is your bones, and that's 10 years old. So your body is renewing itself. And when the renewal slows down, that's when you begin to become osteopenic, and when that gets really severe, osteoporotic. And it's become near epidemic. Right, and you remember in the article you and I wrote some years ago, we could predict pretty much the bone loss of people based on how much tonic, how much soda, how much phosphoric acid stabilized beverage they took in. And the answer is don't do that. Take in lots of hydration, and that is an important issue. They did not control for the hydration status of the people. They didn't control for the stress hormone levels. They didn't control for the calcium magnesium levels. And I do want to say a very important point that is dramatically been reinforced in the 21st century. It's called the ion channel. So let's say the calcium, the magnesium, the doubly charged minerals get into the intestines, because sometimes they're not soluble and then they're not available. Let's assume we're only talking about the better soluble minerals.
Okay.
When that ion channel is happy, when the calcium, magnesium, ATPase channel is optimized and working its best, 1/3 of what you give comes in. 1/3 is the maximum uptake of that ion channel. And we know, in fact, almost everyone knows, if you take enough magnesium, it will eventually build up in your intestines, cause a hypermotility, causing diarrhea. And usually people who do not expect that predictable event are not happy.
Right.
In contrast, as you know, we have pioneered the enhanced uptake and chaperone delivery of what appears to be near fully available magnesium. For example, we have given as much as 440 milligrams of elemental magnesium twice a day because, and this is an issue unto itself, today, when you look at these balance situations, when you look at these ion channels, when you look at the uptake mechanism, you will never be able to replenish the deficit that people have accumulated because of high-tech living. The stress of high-tech living, the acid-forming nature of the diet that is too high in processing elements and too little in fiber, in prebiotics, probiotics, and symbiotics, and things that we together understand are essential for healthy digestion so that your microbiome and your metabolome can have a communion, can have a communication, and that results in new bone forming because with the help of choline citrate, and it must be choline citrate, not choline bitartrate, not choline anything else, with the help of choline citrate, if you take a teaspoon at the same time that you take, say, 220 milligrams of elemental magnesium, which would be 2 capsules of 110 milligrams each, you now appear to get near full uptake. And you can take 2, 3, 4, 5 of those doses daily based on the evidence that you collect on yourself, which is the urine pH after rest.
Right.
So as we know, and as was ignored in the study that we're talking about, as we know, when you sleep, when you hopefully get restorative sleep, when you sleep, the body cleans house. So if there's extracellular acid, that will be concentrated into the urine. And one time during the day, after rest, when you first get up, and yes, while you're asleep, you can go to the bathroom. You just can't go to the gym or the kitchen. But after rest, 6 or more hours, that urine has equilibrated with the lining cells in the bladder, in the GU tract, and you get a non-invasive measure of cellular metabolic acidosis, metabolic syndrome, metabolic status. 6.5 to 7.5 is the healthy range. But most people are below 6.5. And I remind folks it's a logarithmic scale. So the difference between 6.5 and 5.5 is a factor of 10. And the difference between 6.5 and 4.5 is a factor of 100. So small differences in pH have big meanings in biology. And you can get a self-assessment. These are urine pH strips that you make available that we recommend folks use on a regular basis, and keep a log. What's your pH today? And what on whatever rating scale you want to use for yourself. Overall health, restorative sleep, mood, energy, stress level, comfort, whatever your measure is, keep a log. And you will notice that the days when you're more acidic are the days when you're feeling worser, when you're more pessimistic, when your moods are not as stable. And the days when you have enough magnesium, and remember, calcium is the mineral that we need, but it says go, go, go.
Yeah.
Mineral's the mineral we need to say, it's okay to take a deep abdominal breath. It's okay to get still and quiet and calm and so forth. That's what, if magnesium had a voice, that's what magnesium would say. So we want to enhance the uptake of magnesium using choline citrate. I'm glad to tell you that Consumer Labs looked at all the cholines that they could and found that ours was the highest purity, the best value, and the easiest for the consumer. It is a liquid, so you take a teaspoon of the choline citrate at the same time that you take 2 of the magnesium capsules, and you can take 2, 3, 4, 5 of those doses a day, depending on that urine morning pH.
Well, we have certainly found, of course, that magnesium is a key overlooked bone nutrient. Recent studies in Europe showing, very fascinating, that over 25 years of people with the highest magnesium blood levels had no fractures. I mean, it's pretty dramatic. But let's just summarize this particular kind of peculiar study by Burke et al., saying that looking at high dose supplement, looking at various doses of vitamin D, going to high doses, saying, hey, this does not change the bone density we look at. So I think the problems with this study, as I see, is that one, to model a drug study and say we can just give different doses of a nutrient and see that that's enough to create an impact in something as complex as bone mineral density, that is a flawed premise, that there's many factors that are important in the creation and maintenance of bone, and certainly dozens of minerals. We all have identified 20 key nutrients, pH balance, these whole issue of stress hormones, many factors that are very individually important, and you can't just put a group of people together and expect that vitamin D itself is going to be enough to make that difference. I think that's what I hear you saying is one of the major problems. Number two, I see a major problem, and especially given the status, the nutrient status in this country. A new study in New York State just showed that 1/3 of the population does not even get 1 fruit and 1 vegetable a day. So we're all laboring under an acidosis that's really tedious and troublesome and difficult for bone. So there's a complex situation. We're trying to say one variable would change. But the other thing I see is this way of measuring volumetric bone density, which really hasn't done before, to try to understand. We know that we must look at each individual and see what happened to them, and we must see the other factors. What level of vitamin did they achieve? For example, vitamin D, we see some people that need 10,000 units, other people need much less. Very difficult with these large-scale studies without looking at each individual, seeing how they progressed along. Even if you just isolated vitamin D, we have no idea of the adequacy level. They give us a rough idea of the levels people achieve, but so those I see as some of the major flaws, plus the question of volumetric bone density being a whole new measurement. Is there any other summary points of that we think about in this study to assure people stay focused on your vitamin D? It's absolutely essential.
Well, as a professor of molecular medicine for the last half century, I will underscore what you just said. The study was designed in a way that would predictably fail because it was the classic mistaken so-called double-blind, but it wasn't really double-blind, but it was dose ranging, which is a pharmacologic model entirely appropriate for single variable studies of new drugs, and entirely inappropriate for a complex multivariable system, especially where you ignore the epigenetic, human, physical variables that put paid, or that's an old-fashioned way of saying, underscore why the study was not designed in a way that gives you any meaning in life about bone health. Now, that's a strong statement, but it's true. So anyone who's concerned about this study and doesn't understand the fatal flaw of the methodology, the fatal flaw of the design, the fatal flaw of the execution, and the fatal flaw of not really understanding what this new easy bone measurement means, and I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
The fact that these colleagues executed this study over time while ignoring physiology, ignoring molecular biology, ignoring neurochemistry, ignoring microbiome, the digestion, ignoring individuality, biochemical individuality, says they were very narrowly focused on something that gives you results, but no meaning. And by no meaning, I mean none, as in no meaning, because I presume that the reason this article was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, of which I've been a member for over 40 years, is because their editors thought that people should see the point of view that says take none a day in regard to vitamin D.
Right.
I could not disagree more. I think I've been very clear that I think the way in which this was done makes it not relevant to any 21st century human being whose primary concern is the health of their bones. And as we have said, and I want to say again, we have helped people over decades build new bone by including vitamin D in all of what they need as individuals. And we do prefer the Goldilocks scenario, which personalizes the primary predictive, proactive prevention practices and protocols that over decades we have implemented. And we would be happy to explain to our colleagues how to do a proper study of bone health differences over time that includes what was not relevant to this study, which is what is the limitation and what is the strength of this new bone density measurement.
Okay.
So since I am a methodologist, and every year I was in government service, we introduced a fundamental new laboratory method that was more sensitive, that was more specific, that was more cost efficient, that was more predictive. I feel comfortable in looking at this article and saying, if you read it, ignore it, and if you didn't read it, don't.
Perfect. And in the meantime, what people do is stay on target, get their vitamin D level, work to achieve, let's say, 50 to 60 level.
50 to 80, 50 to 80. And I am very comfortable that 50 to 60 is too narrow.
Okay.
If you aim for the bullseye and you only get pretty good, you will have too many disaffected people. If you give them a healthy range, 50 to 80, knowing that if they're a little below 50, they're still much better off than most Americans. And if they're a little over 80, I know they're comfortable. But there are people out there who are recommending that more is better. I've had a colleague try to convince me that people should be somewhere between 120 and 200. Yeah. And I explained to them that they're now in pharmacology and I want to stay in physiology.
Right,
so
right.
50
exactly.
to 80, a safe range, a target range that people can achieve. Many people, as you know, but we want to remind folks that many people have enough atrophy, what's called enteropathy of their digestive tract, such impairment of their digestion, that most of the vitamin D they take does not get taken up because they don't have the digestive capacity. In contrast, we have long recommended that you might want to take K2 and D3 in a capsule baseline, but you adjust your actual blood or serum vitamin D level based on drops under the tongue.
Perfect. So this
because drops under the tongue are very easily taken up. Not everyone understands this, but I do want to explain something that you know very well, which is drops under the tongue are very predictably taken up, and easily so. They don't require any cofactors. They don't require digestive competence. And very often we find that people have been on what seemed like significant supplementation of vitamin D for years, but their level is not even up to 50. But when they take the drops under the tongue, it easily gets there.
That's an extremely important point. And so for all of my population, for this great community of women in the Better Bones, Better Body world that want to enhance their health, stay on target, get your vitamin D measured, or strive for that 50 to 80. If you find you're not getting the levels you think you should, then move to a form that's more easy to assimilate, like these drops, these perk drops. That is really excellent. Get all the nutrients, do the full program, get all the 20 key nutrients, be sure to alkalize, and of course exercise. The byline is we cannot separate one single variable like vitamin D that is studied in such a gross manner over a large population, not knowing what happened with any individual, and say that this is going to be able to change bone density.
Let me add, if I can, recent review articles have shown the following.
Okay.
And this was reported at the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, among other places. Even if you exercise once a week, it benefits every aspect of you, from mood to perception, from restorative sleep to physical comfort. My target today is 10,000 steps, 8 to 10,000 steps a day. I can tell you that when I started wearing a watch that measures how many steps, I was doing much less than that. I was spending much too much time sitting. Now, with the help of these hands-free devices and this device that I can ask, how many steps did I take today? You've got to actually watch the thing. When you use these biometric devices as ways of enabling your better self to express itself, and then I am now very grateful that I walk 8,000 to 10,000 steps a day because it improves my digestion, it improves my sleep. I do go to sleep early. I'm now a kind of farmer. I go early to bed, early to rise. And I'm happy to get out of the bed in the morning because I've been restored.
Right.
Now, for many years, I was, an insecure overachiever, I think is what they call it, which translated into getting minimum sleep. Now, it does turn out that the first 3 sleep cycles, each sleep cycle is about 90 minutes. So the first roughly 3 to 4 hours of your sleep are the most important in terms of your body's renewal, your growth hormone release, your melatonin production and application, and so forth. And there are some people who don't need as much sleep as others.
Right.
And other people really need their 10 to 12 hours. You can talk to Rebecca. She's a wonderful person when she gets enough sleep. And if not, she's grumpy. And understandably so, because it takes different bodies, different amounts of time. And I do think, however you get it, restorative sleep is important. And I will add the extra credit point that if you stretch for 5 minutes when you get in the bed, and then for 5 minutes before you get out of the bed, and then whether you bathe or shower, stretch there too.
Right.
And it's okay while you're stretching to breathe slowly into your abdomen. If you're familiar with yoga, this is Hatha Prana yoga in a certain way.
Yes.
Prana having to do with breath. However you do it, stretch. And now is my challenge. If you want a healthy, long life, and I plan to be dancing at 120 and want my friends with me, if you want a long, healthy life, invest 5% of your time in yourself on a daily basis. Now, you can do the math. It turns out to be 72 minutes. It's just math. But in 72 minutes a day, I can invest in myself enough to renew myself.
Good.
And I take my supplements within that time. And yes, I do eat whole foods, much of which now comes from our permaculture biodynamic food forest in the front yard, thanks to my son Sky, who started it 7 years ago.
Perfect. Yeah, that's
and I am continuously grateful for the fact that my telomeres are getting longer, that my functional age is half of my birth certificate age. And if I can continue that together for the next 40 or 50 years, then I'll be able to say my self-experiment was successful.
exactly.
So I live my life as an open-minded, evidence-based physician, clinician, methodologist, scientist, and I am constantly amazed at how well-intended scientists, and I presume from everything I could tell from the article that these people were very serious about looking at the neurohormone vitamin D, comparing different doses to see impacts on fracture and bone measurement, bone density of some kind, bone volumetric, whatever.
Right,
it's an interesting tool. It's less invasive than others. It's one you can follow on individuals over time. But I've already put in my comment that I think they need to do more people over more time to find out that it is a little bit more nuanced, that the variability is meaningful, and therefore small differences may be different in a mathematical sense, but have no meaning, have no statistical power, have no predictive value. And we together want people to do the things that save their lives, that use nature, nurture, and wholeness, that use physiology before pharmacology, that take into account all of epigenetics, because we are each unique individuals.
Right.
Roger Williams popularized biochemical individuality. Emmanuel Tereskin brought forward the concept of optimum, rather than the daily values that we have are to avoid deficiency diseases like kwashiorkor and pellagra. Well, of course we want to avoid that, but if you want to know the optimum intake, that's very different. And one very specific point. Becky Costello, Andrea Rosenoff, Ron Elleen, and others have for years been trying to get the Office of Dietary Supplements and the FDA to change the magnesium range, daily value, because today, by methodology the amount that is the daily value recommendation is below the daily need. So if you follow the daily value, which is like 350 to 400 milligrams, and your daily turnover is 450 to 500, which Ron Aline and others and Mildred Seelig before him showed. And I do want to underscore another point you made that is very important. There is an inexpensive serum test called serum magnesium. Mm-hmm. And many of us as clinicians learned that the magnesium is mostly inside the cell and the serum is conserved, so the serum doesn't tell you as much as we would like. But my colleague Ron Aline published over a decade ago that if you're in the lower half of the serum magnesium range, you have chronic latent magnesium deficiency. The acronym is CLMD, chronic latent magnesium deficiency. CLMD, and this has been reconfirmed in young college students in Sao Paulo in one study and in others. So it's clear that we want to move people by design into the upper half of the serum magnesium range.
You know,
and what happens over the years, because I'm now going to get very specific. People who move from the lower half to the upper half of the serum range have lower, healthier blood pressures. They have healthier blood fats. They have other markers because magnesium plays so many roles, from protecting essential fats to activating ATP for energy, to buffering to keep the proton gradient so the battery of the cell operates, and on and on. I think it's Carolyn Dean, a colleague, has written and done a new edition of her book, The Magnesium Miracle, which points out why we're deficient. Now, what we have added, you and I and our team, have added the enhanced uptake and chaperone delivery. So now we not only can lament the magnesium deficiency, we have the solution, which is magnesium in available form plus choline citrate, 2 to 5 doses a day, depending on your first morning urine pH, or however the clinician or the health coach recommends.
Yes, that myth that people can't tolerate magnesium. You know, Dr. Jaffe, over the years, you've made so many important contributions, and certainly magnesium really stays in our mind. We remember the early Israeli studies giving 1,000 milligrams of magnesium to women. They built bone density very well. We see this new study in Europe that 25 years, people with the highest serum levels had no fractures, where all the different quadrants had many fractures, increasing the lower magnesium quadrant, the more fracture. So that's such an important thing to keep in mind. And now that we have a solution to this, the magnesium intolerance that people would call it, by making it more, creating a separate neutral pore to take it up with the choline citrate.
Right. And Mildred Seelig talked about this as the magnesium wasters, but as a protege of hers, and Ron Aline also was much closer to her, what we noticed and what she reinforced is that it's the people who have an increase in protein and an increase in processed fats that waste the magnesium. Mm-hmm. And at the Harvard School of Public Health, Frank Hugh and colleagues have just published a very important study that says if you decrease your flesh, your meat intake by even 5%, your long-term health goes up by 30%.
You know,
now, this is observational, but it was observational of thousands and thousands of people, and it reinforces why you want to eat whole foods, low on the food chain, foods that you can digest, that you can assimilate, take in, and eliminate without immune burden. Mm-hmm. And in the 21st century, many, many people have lost immune tolerance, and they don't understand why the foods they eat are fighting back and burdening their immune defense and repair system, making them more hospitable to chronic illness, to infection, and to all the maladies that are become so epidemic today.
You know, I'd like your comment on one other thing, Dr. Jaffe, that when we talk about these nutrients, like we're saying that there's we see such a weak nutrient profile in our diet. And then the most interesting thing on top of that, the people, we aren't eating the foods, but then you have the nutrient content of the foods. For example, I was looking at a study on boron by Laura Pizzorno, and they actually showed the data showing what the standard government tables say the boron content is of food, and then they had another researcher actually chemically analyze that food. It was much lower what's actually in the food today. Do you know of any new studies that really point up, we always talk about the decreasing nutrient content of food. We have certain data, but I think it's amazing. People are still looking at these old tables saying, oh, this orange is giving me so much magnesium, or this almond is giving me so much, when really it looks like the nutrient content of the food is greatly declining.
Well, there's no question. Jim Duke, for many years, as the lead, quote, organic researcher at the United States Department of Agriculture.
What's his name?
Jim Duke.
Jim Duke. Okay. Oh,
Jim Duke.
Yeah.
Jim Duke, also known as James Duke.
Yeah.
Played the fiddle very well. Had a experimental garden at his home that I was privileged to spend time at with him. And many, many others have confirmed that the USDA tables generated in the 1950s and 60s are applicable to the 1950s and 60s. And if I can just give two examples. A carrot today has 5 to 10% of the carotene, carotenoid, 5 to 10% of the mineral content because of monocropping. The exception are organic, which are better, and biodynamic are still healthy and have the same mineral content that they used to. Because in biodynamics, it's like permaculture. You pay a lot of attention to the richness and the nutrient density and availability of the soil, and therefore what goes into the food. And then, of course, the other side, implied by what you said, not only is the good stuff down dramatically, but in commercial foods, the residual toxins, hormone disrupting, persisting pollutants, solvent residues, toxic minerals, mold products, radioisotopes. We didn't used to have to go to the market with a Geiger counter, but in Japan they do. And I predict more and more other people will. And the answer to that is to up your nutrient intake, because the anti-nutrients are going to be there, dear. They're just going to be there. And yes, what we're talking about is particularly important for women. But remember, women make more than 3/4 of the decisions for the men they love about what those men are going to do with regard to healthy habits. Right. So this is both for men and women. Men get fractures. Men get osteoporosis. Men have loss of bone when they follow a typical American lifestyle. Right. And the good news, and this really is the good news, when you change your habits, you change your future. Right. My bone density has gotten healthier and stronger and functionally younger over the last 10 years, where I did more practicing and less preaching. It's easy to preach. It's the practice, right? We can give information and inspiration, but it's the perspiration. It's the effort the person puts in. It's the follow through. It's caring enough about yourself to do the things that we're explaining to you are sufficient and necessary. Perfect. Exactly. Well, thank you very much for this, particularly oversight on this new article and all your other thoughts of these important issues relating to bone health. So we are going to suggest everyone stay on track. Do a real comprehensive, remember that there's many variables for bone health, and the goal is to build overall total system health at the same time that we build bone strength. And there we would offer the predictive biomarkers, the 8 predictive biomarkers that cover all of epigenetics. This includes your hemoglobin A1C, your HSCRP, your homocysteine, your LRA immune tolerance, your vitamin D, your urine pH, your omega-3 to 6 balance, as well as the 8-oxoguanine, the measure of nuclear oxidative damage. You need those 8. Those 8 are sufficient. They cover the 92% of lifetime health. Notice I said 92% of your lifetime quality of life. 92% of how resilient or hospitable you are is epigenetic. It's habits of daily living. 8% is genomics and genetics, and I'm going to do a whole workshop on September 8th for anyone at the PIH Academy on the limitations of the limitations of genomics, the limitations of gene testing, and the strengths of epigenetics. And when you look at the consequences, systematically of the genetic expressions and then the RNA and all the cellular machinery, what you end up with is epigenetics.
And these predictive biomarkers, I really appreciate the fact that you have put them together and you established ideal ranges, ideal
Yes.
targets.
Best outcome goal values. You should be, for hemoglobin A1C, just to pick one, less than 5%. I can tell you that mine started out at above 6, which was not terrible, but wasn't good. And for the last 2 or 3 tests, it's been 4.5%. Why? Because I am sweet enough as I am. Yeah. I don't add sugar. I'll have whole fruit, which is quite sweet, but has pectin and fiber to slow the sugar intake. I basically exclude from my whole foods diet added sugar, empty calorie sugar. Sure. I exclude edible oils because I think they all have imbalanced excess of omega-6 and potential fat-soluble contaminants. And all of the processed foods. So I don't have to worry about trans fats because they don't even come in where I am. What I follow is the advice I got from Beatrice Trum-Hunter. And anyone who knows of her or goes back to her writings, she was very careful about telling you what you needed to know and being very meticulous about her support evidence, Beatrice Trum-Hunter. And she said famously, shop around the perimeter of the store. That's where the food is. If you have to go down the aisles for a spice now and then, okay. But going down the aisles, you're now in the packaged goods world. And remember, those companies that we think of as food companies, they know they're packaged goods companies. And I'm telling you that if it's packaged, it's suspect. And look at the ingredient list. The ingredient list on most of these, even the natural and organic ones, the ingredient list includes things that I'm sure, as a biochemist, as a human being, are not good for my metabolism, to be polite. And I exclude them.
So, Dr. Jaffe, would you tell individuals where they can get your chart of these key biomarkers and the ranges you've established?
Well, surely. Folks are welcome to go to a website called betterlabtestsnow.com.
Okay.
I believe that on your website, Susan, there's a link. If not, there should be, and we'll make it available. And you just look for PB, predictive biomarkers. And any place you see predictive biomarkers, you click, and what will come up is the 8, and we offer you what your goal best outcome target value is. Then we want you to measure what yours is, compare the two, and we'll help you with healthier habits that will translate in just 6 months into a better you. That is, you'll be closer to or at your goal values, and you should celebrate that because now you are resilient and resistant to illness. And if you're not yet at your goal values, after the first 6 months, we'll help you with the next 6 months. And usually it does take 2 or 3 6-month cycles because the day you start on the rest of your life, you have your history to reverse. The good news is that when you give the body what it needs and you reduce the toxic burden and the distress, which is systematically incorporated in what we're including, when you do that, you're in essence changing your future. Now, for too many people, what my grandmother said often, which is the rents are going up and the ceilings are coming down. And what she meant by that is the toxins are going up and the nutrients are coming down. At least that's my interpretation, but she used to say the other. But in the Bronx, that was true at that time.
Yeah.
Today, fortunately, we have choices. You can belong to a CSA, a community-supported agriculture. Ours happens to be biodynamic. You can have your own little garden. My son points out that even if you have 1 square meter, 3 feet by 3 feet, you can grow up something that will nourish you. And probably you'll enjoy watching it change because in my garden, there's a new flower every day. And if you have flowers, the pollinators come.
Right. It's
and if the pollinators come, because it is a web of life. And we want to restore our connection to the web of life. And for those who want to follow this, please look up the predictive biomarkers. Please follow through on having the tests. And then Susan and her team and other health coaches can help you implement a program to restore, to rehabilitate, to improve resilience. And as a collateral benefit, you'll feel and function much better, and your risk of chronic disease will be much lower.
Yes, exactly. We're heading towards a day, and you've really helped initiate that, where we establish ideal markers with ideal ranges, just like we rethink these studies. How do we do a good study in this very complex world, in the complex physiology, to understand really what is a just study, how to do an equitable study when there's so many variables. I appreciate all of your suggestions so much, and we'll be encouraging all of our people to stay on target and do comprehensive programs, not get thrown off target by these fragmented studies.
Better bones, better bodies, better bodies, better bones.
There it is. Thank you much, Dr. Jaffe.
Be well. Thank you all.
Okay.